It was a quiet Friday afternoon, the kind that wraps the lake in a golden hush, the sun hanging lazily over the pine-lined water. I had just settled into my cabin for the weekend, my sanctuary from the chaos of the city, and, more importantly, the homeowners association. Being here meant peace, solitude, and maybe some grilled trout if I was lucky. That was until the knock came. It wasn't just any knock. It had that sharp, urgent, entitled rhythm that only one person in the world could produce. Karen, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, who somehow thought her clipboard gave her dominion over all. I opened the door slowly, coffee in hand, trying to suppress the immediate spike in my blood pressure. There she stood, pressed khakis, oversized sunglasses, and that signature pursed lip frown that made even the squirrels scatter. "Hi," she chirped in a tone that made it clear she didn't care how I was. "We have a situation." I raised an eyebrow. "We?" "Yes, me, my guests, us." She stepped closer to my porch like it belonged to her. "I need you to unlock your cabin." I blinked, then chuckled, assuming this was some kind of bizarre HOA joke. "I'm sorry. What?" "My guests arrived early," she said, as if that explained anything. "The unit I booked for them isn't cleaned yet, and we need somewhere to put them for the next few hours." I took a long sip of my coffee, letting the silence stretch. "So you thought my private cabin, where I'm staying, is a good option?" "Yes," she said completely, unironically. "You're just one person. It's a large cabin. They'll stay on the other side." I laughed out loud. "Karen, that's not happening." Her smile dropped like a lead balloon. "Excuse me?" "No," I said plainly, stepping out onto the porch. "This is my property. You don't have any right to ask, let alone demand I open my door to strangers." She crossed her arms. "As HOA president, I have certain authorities." "No, you don't," I cut in. "You run the newsletter and schedule trash pickups. That's where your power stops." She gasped, like I just kicked her golden retriever. "You are required to be a good neighbor. Being a good neighbor doesn't mean letting you turn my cabin into your personal B&B." Her lips trembled. For a moment I thought she was going to start crying. Instead, she spun on her heel, stormed down the steps, and whipped out her phone. "Oh, you're going to regret this," she snapped over her shoulder. "I'm filing a formal complaint." I shrugged. "Be sure to spell my name right." She vanished into the trees, muttering about citations, bylaws, and the greater good of the community, while I returned to my Adirondack chair and poured myself a second cup of coffee. I had a feeling this was just the beginning. The next morning, I woke to the sound of gravel crunching, a slow, deliberate tread outside my cabin. I peeked through the blinds and wasn't even surprised. There she was again. Karen, standing with arms crossed, lips pinched, and what looked like an official-looking folder in her hand. She wasn't alone this time, though. She had a measuring tape dangling from one hand like she was about to renovate the porch herself. I didn't open the door right away. I took my time brushing my teeth, frying some eggs, and letting her stew in her self-importance. By the time I did open the door, she looked like she was ready to combust. "You've got 5 minutes," I said, stepping onto the porch with a plate of eggs and bacon. Karen snapped the folder open with theatrical flair. "According to Section 3B of the Lakeside Pines HOA Covenant, members must not impede the hospitality efforts of other residents." I chewed slowly. "That's not a real rule." "It is now," she said proudly. "Emergency addendum. Voted in last night." "Voted in by who?" "You and your reflection?" Her eyes narrowed. "You're taking this very lightly. I've submitted a request to fine you for non-compliance." I couldn't help but laugh. "A fine? For refusing to let random people into my home? They were guests, and it was temporary," she snapped. "We all have to make sacrifices for the good of the community." "Karen, this isn't a commune," I said. "This is a lake cabin I paid for. If your guests can't wait an hour for a cleaning crew, that's not my problem." She inhaled sharply and then, unbelievably, took a step toward the cabin door. I moved to block her path. "Don't do it," I warned, setting my plate on the porch rail. "I swear if you so much as touch that doorknob—" "What are you going to do?" she hissed. "Write me up?" "I'll call the sheriff," I said plainly. "Trespassing is still a thing even out here, and your made-up HOA nonsense doesn't override the law." That finally gave her pause. She hovered mid-step, her jaw tight. Her eyes scanned the porch like she might find some clause in the wood grain to justify her behavior. Then, in typical Karen fashion, she changed tactics. "I'm concerned," she said, suddenly softening her tone like I wouldn't notice the shift. "Are you okay? You seem awfully aggressive lately, maybe isolated. You know, people worry about folks who spend too much time alone out here." I stared at her. "You're concerned I won't let you break into my home?" "It's not breaking in," she huffed. "It's community stewardship," I stepped forward. "Karen, if you don't leave this property right now, I'll call the sheriff, file a restraining order, and then plaster a copy of it to the HOA bulletin board myself." For the first time, she backed down. She fumbled with the folder, flipped. It closed, and turned on her heel with a loud, exasperated huff. But just before she disappeared down the path, she threw one last grenade over her shoulder. "You've made a powerful enemy." And then she was gone. I stood there, staring into the trees, waiting for the sound of her footsteps to fade completely. I knew this wasn't over. Karen didn't take no as an answer. To her, no was just the start of negotiations. And something told me she'd be back, with more paperwork, more fake rules, and maybe even more people. I had no idea just how far she was willing to go. That evening, just as the sun was dipping behind the hills and casting a long amber glow, across the lake I noticed something strange. My trash bins, secured earlier that morning, were now wide open. Not tipped over, not ravaged by animals, just open. Lids neatly propped back. It felt calculated. Like someone had wanted me to notice, I shut them and glanced around. The path to Karen's place wound just behind a thicket of brush. I wouldn't put it past her to take a stroll through my property under the guise of a routine perimeter check. She liked that phrase, used it once when I caught her walking behind my cabin at 6 Mile a.m., clipboard in hand like she was scouting for code violations. Still, I wasn't going to jump to conclusions yet. I made a mental note, then locked up everything. Cabin doors, garage, even the kayaks. Something about Karen's last line, "You've made a powerful enemy," kept repeating in my head. She'd said it with such venom, like I'd stolen her birthright, instead of just refusing to turn my cabin into her overflow motel. The next morning brought new drama. I was sipping coffee on the deck again when a small paper slipped under my door. No knock, no footsteps, just the soft flutter of paper on wood. I picked it up. Notice of investigation. Unauthorized modifications to lake cabin property. Lakeside Pines HOA Enforcement Division. Filed by HOA President Karen M.I. Read it twice. According to this notice, I was allegedly in violation of several vague and questionable regulations, unpermitted alterations to deck railings, which I hadn't touched, improper firewood stacking. Seriously? Bam, and this one took the cake. Non-collaborative attitude within HOA-related affairs. Non-collaborative attitude. I actually laughed. She'd invented a behavioral infraction like this, was a private school detention slip. What was next? Emotional? Misconduct. I grabbed a pen, scribbled, "Denied, nonsense, see you in court," on the bottom of the paper, and taped it right back to the HOA bulletin board, smack in the center. Hours passed, quiet and still. I tried to fish, tried to read, but there was a tension now, like something was watching, or waiting. It wasn't paranoia, it was instinct. You don't spend years escaping to a place like this without learning the subtle difference between natural stillness and hostile quiet. At around 4 p.m. I heard it. A faint engine hum. I walked around the cabin and spotted a golf cart. A municipal one, not the HOA toy fleet, trundling up the main gravel path toward Karen's place. 2 men were inside, both in county windbreakers. Interesting. I stayed where I was, just behind the corner of my porch. They pulled up to her cabin. Karen came out fast, too fast, like she'd been waiting at the window. There was gesturing, smiling, then pointing, directly toward my property. I watched as one of the men pulled out a notepad. Karen led them toward the wooded path that curved around to the back of my cabin. She was clearly directing them, guiding. Then, somewhere, she thought she had the upper hand. That's when it clicked. She wasn't just filing complaints now. She was escalating. She was trying to get the county involved. Maybe code enforcement, maybe environmental oversight. Who knew? Karen had always bragged about her network of contacts in local government. I used to think that meant the retired librarian she played bridge with. Now I wasn't so sure. I put down my book, laced up my boots, and headed toward the back lot. If she was going to try something sneaky, I wasn't going to wait and hear about it in the next fake violation letter. What I found waiting for me behind my own tool shed nearly made me drop the flashlight. There, behind my shed, half buried in pine needles and mud, was a collection of odd debris that absolutely hadn't been there the day before. Broken pieces of lattice, not from my deck, several empty paint cans, and a rusted-out pipe that looked suspiciously like it had been planted, and, standing next to it all, beaming like she'd just discovered buried treasure, was Karen. "There it is," she exclaimed, turning to the two county inspectors like she'd just solved a murder case. "What did I tell you? Illegal dumping and possible soil contamination. This is exactly what I was worried about." One of the inspectors scratched his head, visibly unsure. "Ma'am, you said this was behind your property." Karen blinked, then laughed. "Well, yes, it's adjacent, technically, but it's affecting the whole neighborhood, and this individual has a history of non-compliance." I stepped out of the trees slowly, arms folded. "You really brought them out here for this?" Karen whipped around, expression souring instantly. "This is a private inspection. On my land?" The taller inspector frowned. "Wait, this shed belongs to you?" "Every inch of it," I said, pulling my cabin's property map from the laminated folder I kept for emergencies. I handed it over. "You're standing 10 feet inside my boundary line. That's trespassing, gentlemen, unless you've got a warrant or an emergency response order." Karen's mouth flapped open like a broken gate hinge. The inspectors exchanged a glance. The shorter one took the map, studied it, then quietly said, "We'll have to review this at the office." "There's clearly some confusion here." "Confusion?" Karen snapped. "That's contamination. It needs to be reported, immediately." The tall one stepped back. "Ma'am, unless we can confirm these items are hazardous and that they belong to the property owner, we can't proceed further today." I smiled. "Which they don't. And they weren't here yesterday. You know, Karen, it's funny. Your old garden shed had lattice just like that. And didn't your back deck get replaced last spring?" Her eyes narrowed to slits. "I'd be very careful," I added, "about calling in county resources to stage a complaint that might turn out to be fraudulent." She opened her mouth to argue, then stopped. A flicker of doubt crossed her face. Finally, she turned to the inspectors and plastered on a fake breezy smile. "Of course, I'm only trying to be vigilant. We all want what's best for the lake." The shorter inspector muttered something and walked back to the cart. The taller one gave me a tight nod, and they drove off, leaving Karen standing in the woods with her planted pile of junk. "Let me guess," I said, walking toward her slowly. "You thought they'd slap me with a fine, maybe force me off the property while they investigated. That right?" She didn't answer. "Just glared." "This is over," I told her, turning to head back toward my cabin. "You've crossed the line, literally and legally." Her voice came soft, sharp, like a snake in dry grass. "You think you've won?" I stopped. "Didn't." "Turn around. You haven't," she said. "This lake, this community, it doesn't work without order, without leadership." I turned back just enough to meet her eyes. "Leadership doesn't mean control, Karen," I said. "It means knowing when to back off." She stood there, frozen, expression unreadable. For once she had no clever retort, no citation to wave, no rule to twist, just silence. But something in her stance told me it wasn't surrender. It was strategy. She was recalculating, and I knew this wasn't the last play in her game. The next couple of days passed without incident, too quiet, like the lake itself was holding its breath. Karen's absence was noticeable. Her usual morning patrols, the echo of her voice barking into her phone, the clack of her golf cart, gone. Most would have seen it as a victory. I didn't. It wasn't her style to vanish. No, she was plotting. Karen wasn't the kind of person who gave up. She was the kind who waited, coiled, and struck when you started to feel safe. I stayed alert. I double-checked my locks, installed a few trail cams around the property just in case. I'd dealt with HOA nonsense before, but not like this. This was personal now. Then, on the fourth morning, I found the envelope. No postage, no name, just a crisp, cream-colored envelope tucked beneath the windshield wiper of my truck. I opened it slowly, half expecting it to explode in glitter or bees or some HOA-branded curse. But it was worse. Inside was a single sheet of expensive stationery, printed with formal serif type, Notice of Motion, Emergency HOA, Board, Vote Subject, Temporary Revocation of Property Use Rights, Non-Compliant Member, Date, tomorrow, 6 p.m. at HO. The pavilion filed by Karen M., HOA President. All members are encouraged to attend. Motion pertains to repeated disruption, defiance of community standards, and obstruction of guest accommodations. I stared at it. This wasn't a complaint. This was a power move. She was trying to get the board, the handful of retirees she'd schmoozed and manipulated for years, to vote me out. Not legally, of course. She couldn't evict me. But she was playing a psychological game, hoping to smear my name across the lake community like I was some kind of dangerous outlaw. I folded the paper slowly and slid it into my back pocket. It was time to stop playing defense. The next day, I arrived early to the pavilion, a small wooden structure nestled beneath the pines, just up from the water. Karen was already there, pacing in front of the podium with a manila folder clutched in her hands and a smug, preemptive smile on her face. "Well, well," she said as I stepped onto the platform, "I wasn't sure if you'd show." "I wouldn't miss it," I said, scanning the setup. The chairs were arranged neatly, a pitcher of water sat on the table, and a legal pad had been laid out with pens. "Good," she said brightly, "because this meeting will determine how we proceed with your situation." "My situation," I repeated. Karen nodded, then adjusted a stack of printed documents on the table like she was about to defend a Supreme Court case. "This is a democratic process, and I trust the board will act in the best interests of the Bay community." I raised an eyebrow. "And what exactly are you proposing?" Her grin widened. "Temporary revocation of property usage, no lake access, no amenity privileges, and a mandatory compliance workshop before reactivation, pending board review, of course. So you want to blacklist me from using my own property?" "Not blacklist," she said sweetly. "Just redirect, guide, correct." I leaned in. "You have no legal authority to enforce any of that." "True," she replied, still smiling. "But perception is everything. Once the community sees how difficult you're being, how uncooperative—" She trailed off and let the silence speak for itself. I could almost admire the strategy if it wasn't so underhanded. But she'd made one big mistake. "I hope you brought copies," I said. She frowned. "Of what?" "Everything. Complaints, evidence, meeting notices. Copies of that planted junk pile." "Because I did." I pulled out a folder of my own, thicker than hers. Every letter she'd left, every photo from my trail cams, including one particularly damning image of her dragging those old lattice pieces down the trail captured in high-res night vision. Karen's smile finally cracked. I took the legal pad and started laying out my pages like a dealer at a high-stakes poker table. "Let's talk transparency," I said, just as the first few board members began to arrive. And I knew. This wasn't just about stopping Karen anymore. It was about exposing her. By the time the board members settled into their seats, 5 in total, all retired, all well acquainted, With Karen's leadership, I had every document spread out in precise rows on the table. Karen stood frozen, her eyes darting from page to page, her expression shifting like a storm cloud. "Good evening," she began, voice chipper, trying to regain control. "As you all know, this is a special emergency session regarding one of our more uncooperative residents." "Actually," I interrupted, not bothering to stand, "this is a session about transparency, accountability, and the abuse of position, because that's what this has become." Karen's smile flattened like a tire on gravel. "I'll have my say, and then you'll have yours." I raised a photo, the one from my trail cam. "Let's start here. This was taken behind my shed 3 days ago. That's you, dragging junk from your property to mine." A ripple passed through the board. One of them, Frank, the former park ranger and usually one of Karen's staunchest allies, leaned forward. "Is that true, Karen?" She scoffed. "That's ridiculous. That could be anyone in a hoodie." "Zoom in," I said. "Note the HOA badge clipped to the zipper. Only one person wears it upside down." "You." Karen went pale. "Want more?" I held up another photo. "Here's a copy of the fake violation notice you slipped under my door. Notice the font doesn't match HOA standard forms. No watermark, no board signatures, just your name." Karen's voice wavered. "I was acting in the community's interest." "Were you also acting in their interest when you tried to fabricate an environmental violation?" I slapped down a copy of a county email I'd requested under open record laws. The inspectors noted no grounds for any infraction and confirmed the items found were likely recently placed. They also noted your confusion about the property line, which I should mention. I unfolded my laminated boundary map. Again, clearly puts that shed inside my property. Frank took the map, adjusted his glasses, and stared. He turned to Karen. "You told us that junk pile was on your lot. You said it had been there for weeks." Karen opened her mouth, but no sound came out. "And finally," I said, producing the last sheet, "I'd like to present a formal countermotion to the board, removal of President Karen M. from her position for abuse of power, falsification of complaints, attempted defamation, and willful trespass." The room fell silent. Karen blinked. You can't do that. You need a 2/3 vote," Frank spoke first. "I vote aye." Then Margaret. "Aye." Another. "Aye." Karen's eyes swept the room, desperate. "You're making a mistake. He's manipulating this. He's dangerous." I leaned back. "Dangerous? For what? Not letting strangers sleep in my cabin? For standing up to your power trip?" Silence again. The final board member, an older woman who hadn't said a word all evening, looked Karen in the eye and simply said, "Aye." That was 4. Karen gasped, like the air had been sucked from the pavilion. "This is my board." "Any more?" Frank said, standing. Karen turned to me, but there was no venom left in her voice now, just disbelief. "You don't understand what you've done. This place runs because of people like me." "No," I said, standing too. "This place survives in spite of people like you." She turned, stiffly gathered her folder, now pathetic and half-empty next to mine, and walked out into the dusk without another word. Her golf cart trundled off a moment later, slower than usual. Maybe she finally felt the weight of the neighborhood watching, but even as she disappeared down the trail, I knew she wasn't finished. People like Karen don't stop when they lose control. They regroup, they reload, and they wait for the next opening. The following days brought a strange, almost eerie calm to the lake. Karen's absence from the usual HOA operations was immediately felt, but not in the way she probably expected. The air felt lighter. Neighbors who had once only offered polite nods now stopped to chat. I even got a few quiet thank yous slipped my way. No fanfare, just subtle acknowledgments from people who had clearly felt the weight of Karen's reign for years. But I knew better than to believe it was over. Karen wasn't the type to go quietly, and certainly not the type to accept accountability. Her silence was the silence of retreat, not defeat. She hadn't left the lake, just the spotlight. And people like her, they thrived in the shadows. I kept my routine tight, locked up early, watched the cameras. I even started a habit of photographing my property every morning, cataloging everything, just in case I needed proof of what wasn't there before something mysteriously was. And sure enough, it didn't take long. One foggy morning, I walked out onto my dock to drink my coffee when I noticed it, a small metal stake driven into the ground at the base of my shoreline. Bright orange tape fluttered from the top. It wasn't there the day before, I was certain, and it looked official. I walked over and crouched down. There was a tag affixed, "Survey in progress, do not remove filed. Lakeside Pines Oversight Initiative contact, KM Oversight Services, KM, Karen Marie. She'd created a shadow committee." I stared at the marker, heart slowing with the realization. This wasn't an HOA action. There was no Lakeside Pines Oversight Initiative. It was a bluff, but a carefully designed one. She was testing the waters again, quite literally, seeing if she could reclaim authority by sheer force of perception. Took out my phone, snapped a few pictures, then followed the shoreline. 2 more stakes, one by the waterline, one just under the old birch tree where I kept my canoe, each with the same tag, the same orange tape, the same initials. It wasn't just a threat, it was a message. She was back. That evening, I heard the hum of her golf cart again, low and distant, no lights on. She wasn't coming to confront me yet. She just wanted me to know she was there, watching, waiting. Sat on the porch with my coffee, gaze steady toward the tree line. "You want a war?" I muttered under my breath. "You just declared it." And if she wanted to play games with imaginary committees and forged tags, I had news for her. I could play a lot dirtier. I opened my laptop, pulled up my documents, and started drafting a formal complaint, this time not to the HOA, but to the county land office. I attached the photos, listed the fraudulent initiative name, and included everything I had on Karen's continued attempts to exert authority she no longer possessed. Hidata wouldn't stop her. Not immediately, but it would draw a line, a bright, legal, undeniable line, and if she dared to cross it again, she'd be stepping straight into something even she couldn't wiggle out of. Let the game begin. 2 days later, the county called me. "Mummer back," a measured, no-nonsense voice on the line. "Mr. Redacted, we've reviewed the documents and photos you submitted. There is no such initiative on file under that name, nor any licensed surveyor affiliated with KM Oversight Services. We'll be investigating the matter as unauthorized land surveying and potential impersonation of a county service." I thanked them and hung up, the satisfying click of the receiver like a final seal on a trap. Now Karen was officially on record, not just with the HOA, but with local authorities. She had stepped way out of her lane this time, and it wasn't just annoying anymore. It was illegal, but she didn't know that yet. That's the funny thing about people who rely on fear and confusion. They assume everyone else is as disorganized as they are. She thought I'd react the way most of the community had for years, with nervous compliance and silent resentment. She didn't realize I had receipts, I had time, I had patience. And I also had something she'd never expected: resolve. That night, as the wind stirred the branches and the lake settled into its usual quiet rhythm, I noticed her again, a faint silhouette standing just beyond the tree line across the narrow inlet, motionless, not hiding but not announcing herself either, just watching. I didn't move. I wanted her to see me notice her. I wanted her to know I saw her. I raised my coffee cup in salute. She turned and walked back into the woods. The next morning, I woke up to find something new on my property, a small hand-written note pinned to my dock post with a fishing hook. Some people don't understand what's good for a community until it's gone. Be careful what you tear down. Okay? I stared at the note for a long time, not because of the threat, it was a hollow one, but because of what it revealed. Karen still believed she was the victim, that removing her from power wasn't a correction of abuse, but a crime against the order she'd created. She truly couldn't comprehend that the community had moved on, even if silently. I took the note, slid it into a plastic sleeve, and added it to the file. Every move she made was another brick in the case I was building, and I knew eventually she'd push too far. She couldn't help herself, and sure enough, she did. It happened 3 nights later. A storm was rolling in, thick clouds crawling across the sky, wind pushing waves against the rocks. I'd just finished securing the canoe and checking the windows when I heard the sound. Clink! It came from the far side of the cabin near the generator shed. A sound that didn't belong. I grabbed my flashlight and crept around back, boots crunching, on gravel. And there she was. Karen, crouched low in a raincoat, one hand on the latch to the shed. I froze in the shadows, watching her breathe, watching her hesitate. She didn't know I was there. She was going to tamper with the generator, and that, finally, was the moment she crossed the last irreversible line. I didn't yell. I didn't stomp up behind her or slam on the flashlight to catch her in the act. Instead, I quietly raised my phone, hit record, and began filming. The soft red light of the screen pulsed like a heartbeat. Karen, oblivious, fumbled with something metallic in her hand. Looked like wire cutters, while she mumbled under her breath, likely rehearsing whatever excuse she planned to deliver. If caught, she popped the latch. Just like that. Trespassing, tampering, and with tools. I got it all on video. Then I spoke. "Cutting power now, Karen? That's your next move?" She jerked upright like she'd been electrocuted, stumbling backward and slipping in the wet pine needles. See, what are you doing sneaking around behind me?" she barked, immediately trying to spin it. "I thought I heard something suspicious." "I was investigating." "With bolt cutters?" I asked, stepping forward, light now full on her face. Her eyes twitched at the beam. She thrust the tool behind her like a child hiding candy. "This isn't what it looks like." "Oh, it's exactly what it looks like. You broke into my shed on camera with tools in hand. You've been harassing me, creating fake notices, faking survey tags, and now you're messing with my generator?" "In a storm?" Her eyes flashed. "This generator is non-compliant with our noise ordinance. The board removed. You don't speak for anyone now. And guess what?" I raised my phone. "You've officially crossed into felony territory. You want to explain this to the sheriff?" Something in her cracked then. A flicker of realization, the mask slipping. Not rage, fear. She tried to recover, straightening her shoulders like she could still pull rank. "You wouldn't call them. You'd drag this community into scandal, embarrass everyone? Over what? Some power struggles and misunderstandings?" "You brought scandal the second you tried to sabotage someone's property," I snapped. "The only thing I'm dragging is evidence, right to the county prosecutor." She took a step forward, hands raised, her voice softening. "Now, listen. You're blowing this out of proportion. We don't need to involve the sheriff. We can work this out. Privately." I stared at her, then slowly shook my head. "No, you had your chance. You had dozens of chances. And every time you chose power. Over people, control over cooperation. You made this personal. So now it's going to get official." She opened her mouth again, but I was already walking back toward the cabin. "I'm filing this tonight," I called over my shoulder, "and if you so much as step on my property again, you're getting served." The rain began as I reached the porch, heavy and deliberate. She didn't follow, just stood there in the dark, the wind whipping her soaked hair around her face, staring at the shed she'd just broken into. I shut the door behind me and locked it. Inside, I made 3 copies of the video. One to the county sheriff, one to my attorney, one to the cloud, in case things mysteriously disappeared. The storm outside roared louder, but inside, for the first time in weeks, I felt calm. She'd made her final play, and I was done playing. By morning, the storm had passed, but the damage Karen had done was still very real, and now well documented. I drove into town early, file folder on the passenger seat, thumb drive in my coat pocket, and the video queued up on my phone. I wasn't just reacting anymore, I was going on offense. First stop was the sheriff's office, where I filed a formal complaint and handed over every piece of evidence I had. The deputy took one look at the footage of Karen cutting the latch on my generator shed and said, "Yeah, this isn't a neighborly dispute anymore." They assured me the matter would be investigated immediately, and I left with a copy of the report and the kind of quiet satisfaction that only comes when you know the tide's finally turning. But I didn't stop there. I went next to the county recorder's office. I'd already reported her fake survey markers, but now I wanted to go further, get official documentation of my property boundaries filed and notarized. I was done letting Karen weaponize confusion. I had the boundaries mapped, surveyed, and now registered. No more arguments, no more fake committees. By the time I returned to the cabin, the clouds had fully broken. Sunlight cut through the trees like a verdict. Everything looked brighter, cleaner, until I saw the sign. It was nailed to the pine tree at the edge of my driveway, a freshly cut piece of plywood, spray-painted in red block letters, "This isn't over. You're ruining everything beneath." That, her initials. KM, again. I pulled it down slowly, not out of fear, but with the tired patience of someone who'd been expecting one last tantrum. I snapped a photo of it, threw it in the back of the truck, and sent the image straight to the sheriff's office with a short note, just in case she wants to say she's done. She isn't. That was the moment I realized Karen wasn't just lashing out. She was unraveling. This wasn't a plan anymore. It was desperation. She had lost her title, her perceived control, and now her reputation was crumbling too. And people like Karen, when the curtain drops, don't go down with grace. They flail, they cling, they threaten, but I wasn't afraid of her, not anymore. Later. That afternoon, as I was raking the path near the dock, I heard the distinct crunch of tires on gravel. I looked up and saw it, a county-marked SUV pulling slowly into the drive. A uniformed deputy stepped out, clipboard in hand. Not aggressive, just official. "Afternoon," he called. "Mind if I talk to you for a minute?" "Not at all," I said, brushing off my hands. He flipped a few pages. "We stopped by Ms. M's property earlier this morning. She was home. Denied everything, of course. Claimed you fabricated the video. Said it was deep-faked." I actually laughed. "She say I faked the weather too?" He smirked. "Pretty much. We advised her that she's now the subject of an active investigation for trespassing and attempted criminal mischief. Served her with a cease and desist." She tried to argue, but, well, the evidence you handed over's pretty compelling. "Glad to hear it." The deputy closed the clipboard and glanced around the peaceful landscape, the glimmering water, the creaking pines. "Nice place you got here? Shame it's been caught up in all this mess." I nodded. It was peaceful. Hoping to get back. "To that? Well," he said, tipping his hat, "from the look of it, she's run out of moves, but let us know if she makes another one." He climbed back into his vehicle and rolled off slowly down the path. And for the first time in weeks, I stood there in the clean air. No sign of her footsteps, no threatening letters, no surveillance. Just the breeze across the water and the quiet creak of the dock, but I knew Karen. She wasn't done. Not yet.